You know what's wild? I spent 3 years of my life working at a place that most people don't even know existed. Not Los Alamos, not Oak Ridge. I'm talking about a remote facility in the Idaho desert where we did something that had never been done before in human history. We made electricity from nuclear power, and I was there when it happened. My name is Thomas, and between 1951 and 1954, I was an operator at Experimental Breeder Reactor I. EBR-I, we called it, the world's first nuclear power plant. Now, before you click away thinking this is going to be some dry technical lecture, let me tell you something. This story has everything. Groundbreaking science, sure, but also late-night emergencies, moments of genuine terror, bureaucratic absurdity, and a group of people who were making it all up as we went along. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being first. There's no instruction manual. There's no one to call when things go wrong. You're writing the rules in real time, and sometimes those rules are written in the middle of a crisis at 2 in the morning. So stick around. I'm going to tell you what it was really like to work at the dawn of the nuclear age. The good parts, the terrifying parts, and the parts that still make me shake my head 70 years later. Let's start at the beginning. It's 1951. I'm 24 years old. Fresh out of the Navy with training in electrical systems and a degree in physics from a state school you've never heard of. The war's been over for 6 years, but the world is still pretty much running on that wartime energy. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels important. I see a posting for reactor operators needed in Idaho. The pay is good, really good, and the job description is vague in that way that makes you think something interesting is happening. So I apply. 3 rounds of interviews later, I'm on a train heading west with a security clearance and instructions to report to something called the National Reactor Testing Station. I don't really know what I'm getting into. They've told me almost nothing, just that it's important work, it's classified, and I'll be working with nuclear energy. The train drops me in Idaho Falls. Small town, maybe 15,000 people at the time. Nice enough place, but it's not exactly thriving. This is ranching country. Potato farms. Not the kind of place you'd expect to find cutting-edge science. A government car picks me up. We drive, and drive, and drive some more, 40 miles into the desert. Now, I grew up in Pennsylvania. Trees everywhere. Rivers, green. This Idaho desert is something else entirely. Sagebrush as far as you can see. Volcanic rock, the kind of landscape that looks like the moon decided to set up shop on Earth. And in the middle of all this nothing, we pull up to a guardhouse. Welcome to the National Reactor Testing Station. 800 square miles of empty desert that the government has fenced off for nuclear experiments. It's 1951, and the Atomic Energy Commission has decided that if we're going to split atoms for peacetime purposes, we better do it somewhere that's far away from, well, everyone. The driver takes me to EBR-I. I'm not going to lie to you. My first thought is, this is it. It's a small building, brick and concrete, maybe 40 feet on each side, painted white. There's a small office area, a control room, and the reactor building itself. Out back there's a cooling system and some auxiliary buildings. The whole complex is maybe the size of a small warehouse. This is supposed to be the future of energy. But then I meet the team, and I start to understand that size doesn't matter when you're doing something that's never been done before. Here's something they don't tell you about major scientific breakthroughs. They're not usually accomplished by hundreds of people in white coats working in some massive laboratory. A lot of the time, it's a small group of dedicated, slightly crazy people who are willing to work ridiculous hours on something that might not even work. EBR-I had maybe 20 of us on site at any given time. Walter Zinn was the director. Brilliant guy. He'd worked on the Manhattan Project under Enrico Fermi. If Zinn told you something was safe, you believed him. Not because he was reckless, but because he'd done the calculations 3 times over and had 2 other people check his work. Then there were the engineers, the physicists, the technicians, and guys like me, the operators. We were the ones who'd be actually running this thing once it was operational. What struck me in those first few days was how young everyone was. I'd expected, I don't know, older scientists with gray hair and decades of experience. Instead, most of the team was in their 20s and 30s. We'd all cut our teeth during the war years in one capacity or another. There was this energy in the air, this sense that we were on the edge of something massive. During my first week, one of the senior engineers takes me on a tour of the reactor. We're standing in the reactor room, and he's explaining the basics. This, he says, pointing to a cylindrical assembly about the size of a trash can, is where we're going to create a controlled nuclear chain reaction. The heat from that reaction will create steam. The steam will drive a turbine. The turbine will generate electricity. I nod like I completely understand. And this has been done before, I ask. The chain reaction part? Sure. Fermi did that in Chicago in 1942. The electricity part. He grins. That's what we're here to figure out. Oh, so we're not following a proven process. We're inventing the process. That's when it really hits me. I'm not just going to operate a nuclear power plant. I'm going to help prove that nuclear power plants can exist. No pressure or anything. The first few months were intense education. I thought I knew physics. I thought I understood nuclear reactions. Turns out, there's a pretty big gap between textbook knowledge and practical application when you're dealing with uranium and plutonium. Let me give you a crash course in what we were doing, and I promise I'll keep this as simple as possible, because the basics are actually pretty straightforward. Nuclear fission is what happens when you split an atom. Specifically, we were splitting uranium-235 atoms. When you do this, you release energy, a lot of energy. You also release neutrons, which can then split other uranium atoms, which releases more energy and more neutrons, which split more atoms, and so on. That's a chain reaction. In a bomb, this happens all at once. Boom! Hiroshima. In a reactor, you control it. You let it happen slowly and steadily. You use that energy to heat water, create steam, and drive turbines to generate electricity. The tricky part is the control. How do you keep a chain reaction going without letting it run away? How do you start it? How do you stop it? How do you keep everything from melting down? That's what we were figuring out. EBR-I used control rods. These are rods made of materials that absorb neutrons, cadmium in our case. When the control rods are fully inserted into the reactor core, they absorb so many neutrons that the chain reaction can't sustain itself. Pull the rods out, and the reaction starts up. Push them back in, and it stops. Simple in theory. In practice, there are about 1,000 variables you need to monitor and adjust. We spent weeks training on the control systems, learning how to read the instruments, understanding what each gauge and meter was telling us, practicing emergency procedures until we could do them in our sleep. Because here's the thing about working with nuclear reactors. When something goes wrong, it often goes wrong fast. You don't have time to flip through a manual or call for help. You need to know exactly what to do, and you need to do it immediately. They drilled this into us over and over. Emergency shutdown procedures. What to do if you lose coolant. What to do if the reaction starts running too hot. What to do if the instruments fail. In an emergency, one of the supervisors told us, "You're going to feel panic trying to take over. That's natural, but you can't let it. You need to stay calm, think clearly, and follow the procedures. Lives might depend on it. Maybe your own." Great pep talk, really inspiring stuff. But he was right. Let me set the scene for you. It's late afternoon on December 20th, 1951. Cold outside. Idaho winters are no joke, and even though we're in the desert, it gets down to single digits at night. Inside the facility, though, it's warm. We've got the heating running, and the reactor room itself is starting to heat up from all the equipment we've been testing. We've been building up to this moment for months. The reactor is loaded with fuel. All the systems have been checked and double-checked. We've run through every procedure, every simulation, every possible scenario we can think of. Today's the day we're going to attempt to generate electricity from nuclear power for the first time in history. The team is nervous. Excited, but nervous. We all know how significant this is. We also all know that we're venturing into completely unknown territory. Walter Zinn is there, of course. He's calm, which helps everyone else stay calm. There are a few government observers present. Some brass from the Atomic Energy Commission. Everyone's trying to act casual, but you can feel the tension. I'm at one of the control panels with another operator, monitoring the reactor instruments. My job is to watch the neutron flux and the temperature readings and call out any changes. Around 1:30 p.m., we begin the startup procedure. The control rods start withdrawing, slowly, incrementally. We're monitoring everything. Neutron levels, temperature, everything. The reactor goes critical. That means the chain reaction is now self-sustaining. We're maintaining a steady level of fission. So far, so good. The heat starts building. We can see it on the temperature gauges. The liquid metal coolant is heating up. It's flowing through the reactor core, absorbing heat and transferring it to the heat exchanger. This is the moment of truth. The heat exchanger is converting water to steam. The steam is building pressure, and that pressurized steam is being directed to a small turbine. We watch, we wait, and then one of the engineers yells, "We've got generation!" The turbine is spinning. The generator is producing power, actual, honest-to-God electricity from nuclear fission. The lights flicker. 4 small bulbs wired directly to the generator light up. Now, I know what you're thinking. 4 light bulbs. That's it? That's the big achievement? But you have to understand, it's not about the amount of power. It's about the proof of concept. We've just demonstrated that you can take the energy from splitting atoms and convert it into usable electricity. This is the moment that nuclear power becomes real. Everyone starts cheering. Zinn is smiling. People are shaking hands, clapping each other on the back. The government observers are nodding approvingly, already thinking about the implications. We run the reactor for a few more hours, generating electricity, monitoring everything, making sure it's all stable and controllable. It works. It actually works. That night, back at the barracks, nobody can sleep. We're all too wound up. We keep talking about it, going over every detail, still not quite believing we pulled it off. We've just changed the world. Right there in the middle of the Idaho desert, in a small building that looks like it could be a storage facility, we've proven that nuclear power is possible. The next day, the news goes public. Headlines across the country. Atomic energy creates electricity. Nuclear power plant generates light. We're suddenly famous. Well, the facility is famous. Most of us remain anonymous because of security classifications, but we know what we did. And that's enough. Here's what they don't show you in the news coverage or the history books. After that first successful test, after all the celebrations and congratulations, we still had to come to work every day and actually operate this thing. And operating a nuclear reactor? It's not glamorous. Most days were routine, almost boring if you can call working with radioactive materials boring. We ran shifts around the clock, 3 8-hour shifts, rotating. I worked all of them at various times. Day shift, swing shift, night shift, each had its own character. Day shift was when the scientists and engineers were most active. They'd be running experiments, taking measurements, analyzing data. As an operator, you were constantly making small adjustments based on what they needed. Swing shift was usually quieter. The brass had gone home. It was mostly just us technical folks. Good time to do maintenance, run diagnostics, that kind of thing. Night shift was the strangest. Out there in the desert, in the middle of the night, the facility felt incredibly isolated. If you went outside for a break, the silence was absolute. No traffic sounds, no city lights on the horizon. Just you, the stars, and a building containing an active nuclear reactor. Our main job was monitoring, always monitoring. Temperature readings, neutron flux, control rod positions, coolant flow rates, radiation levels. We had dozens of instruments, and they all needed to be watched. We kept logs, detailed logs. Every hour, we'd record all the key parameters. Any unusual readings got noted immediately. Any adjustments we made, no matter how small, got documented. This might sound tedious, but it was crucial. We were still learning how this reactor behaved. Every data point was valuable. Sometimes you'd see patterns in the logs that would reveal something important about how the reactor operated. And then there was the radiation safety aspect. Look, we knew we were working with dangerous materials. We weren't idiots, but the understanding of radiation safety in the early 1950s was, let's say, evolving. We wore dosimeters, film badges that would show if you'd been exposed to radiation. You'd turn them in weekly, and they'd develop the film and measure your exposure. We had protocols for working in contaminated areas, protective clothing, respirators when needed, decontamination procedures. But there was also a lot of, hey, it's probably fine. I remember one time we needed to access a valve that was in an area with elevated radiation levels. Not dangerous for short exposure, but not great either. One of the engineers just shrugs and says, "I'll run in, close the valve, and run out. Should only take 30 seconds. And he did. Just sprinted in, turned the valve, sprinted out. The health physicist nearly had a heart attack when he found out. You can't just run into a radiation area without proper authorization and monitoring, he yelled. The engineer laughed. Why not? It worked. That kind of attitude was more common than it should have been. We were cowboys, in a way. Pioneers. And pioneers sometimes take risks that, in hindsight, weren't the smartest. But we were also careful. The safety protocols we did have, we followed religiously. Because we'd all heard the stories from the Manhattan Project, we knew what radiation could do. And despite the occasional cowboy move, nobody at EBR-I was seriously injured by radiation during my time there. We got lucky, sure. But we were also more careful than we sometimes appeared. You want to know what a nuclear reactor sounds like? I can still hear it. There's the constant hum of the ventilation system. The facility is maintained at negative pressure, so if there's any kind of breach, air flows in rather than contaminated air flowing out. That means fans. Always fans. Running 24/7. You've got the cooling pumps. These are pumping liquid metal through the reactor core, and they make this distinctive whirring sound. It becomes background noise after a while, but when you first start, it's all you hear. Then there are the control systems, servos and actuators for the control rods. When adjustments are being made, you hear these precise mechanical movements, clicks and whirs, alarms. Oh boy, the alarms. We had alarms for everything: high temperature, low coolant flow, unusual neutron flux, radiation detection. Some were bells, some were buzzers, some were just flashing lights. Most of the time, alarms were false or triggered by something minor. But you never ignored an alarm. Ever. You acknowledged it, you investigated, and you resolved it. I remember one night shift where an alarm went off every single hour. Different alarm each time, but all false. Equipment glitches, mostly. By hour 6, we were all exhausted and irritable, but we investigated every single one with the same thoroughness as the first. Because the moment you start assuming alarms are false is the moment a real emergency sneaks past you. The smell is harder to describe. There's ozone. Nuclear reactions produce ozone, and it has this sharp, clean smell. Like right after a lightning storm. Once you've smelled it, you never forget it. There's hot metal. Not a burning smell, just that distinct scent of metal being heated. The reactor got hot. Really hot. And even with all the shielding and cooling, you could sometimes catch a whiff of that heat. There's also the smell of the desert. When you stepped outside, especially in summer, you got hit with this dry, dusty sagebrush scent. It was such a contrast to the controlled, filtered air inside the facility, and occasionally there was the smell of fear. That's not poetic. That's real. When something went wrong, you could literally smell the stress. Sweat and adrenaline, bodies dumping chemicals into the bloodstream as the fight-or-flight response kicked in. Because as routine as most days were, there were moments when things got very real, very fast. It's 2 a.m. on a Wednesday in August of 1952. I'm on night shift with 2 other operators. We've been running steady for hours. Everything's nominal. I'm actually fighting to stay awake because it's so routine. Then the neutron flux alarm goes off. We all snap to attention immediately. I check the gauge. Neutron flux is rising. Not drastically, but it's definitely climbing above normal operating levels. I see it, I call out. Flux is up 7% and climbing. Control rods? One of my colleagues asks. I check. Position is nominal. They haven't moved. This is weird. Neutron flux shouldn't be climbing if the control rod position hasn't changed. Inserting rods 5%, I announce, following procedure. I adjust the controls, pushing the rods slightly deeper into the core. The flux stops climbing. Good. But it's not decreasing. It's just holding steady at the elevated level. Flux is stable at plus 7%, I report. We're all staring at the instruments now, trying to figure out what's happening. Temperature readings start ticking up. Just a degree or two, but it's movement. Temperature increasing? Another operator calls out. Something's not right. We've got elevated neutron flux and rising temperature, and the standard response isn't bringing things back to normal. I'm calling the supervisor, I say, reaching for the phone. The night supervisor arrives 10 minutes later. He's pulling on his jacket as he walks in, but he's alert. He takes one look at the readings and frowns. How long has it been like this? He asks. About 15 minutes. We inserted the control rods 5% when it started, but it's not responding the way it should. He studies the instruments for a long moment. Insert another 5%, he orders. I do. The flux finally starts to decrease. Slowly, but it's going down. Temperature stabilizes. Keep it there. Monitor everything. I want readings every 5 minutes, logged. We spend the next 3 hours watching those instruments like hooks. The flux gradually comes back down to normal. Temperature follows. Everything eventually stabilizes. But we still don't know what caused it. The next day, the engineers start investigating. They pull data logs. They analyze every variable. They're trying to figure out what triggered that surge in reactivity. It takes them a week to figure it out. Turns out there had been a slight shift in the fuel assembly. Nothing dramatic, just a tiny movement, maybe a millimeter or 2. But that was enough to change the neutron geometry slightly, which increased the reactivity. These fuel assemblies were held in place mechanically, and thermal expansion from repeated heating and cooling cycles had caused some slight loosening over time. The solution? Better fuel assembly restraints, modified designs to prevent this kind of movement. But here's what stuck with me about that incident. We didn't panic. We followed procedures. We called for help when we needed it. We monitored and documented everything, and we figured it out. That's what made me confident that nuclear power could work. Not the technology itself, but the people operating it. We were professional, careful, and willing to learn from every anomaly. Still, I won't lie. Those 3 hours watching those instruments, not knowing if things were going to stabilize or spiral out of control, were some of the longest hours of my life. Working at EBR-I wasn't just about the reactor. It was also about living in one of the most remote places you can imagine. The nearest real town was Idaho Falls, 40 miles away. Most of us lived in barracks or small apartments on the testing station. There were maybe 200 people total living on site, working at various facilities, and there was nothing else around. Nothing. Entertainment was whatever you made it. We had a small rec room, ping-pong table, some decks of cards, a radio that picked up maybe 3 stations if the weather was good. On days off, some guys would drive into Idaho Falls, catch a movie, get a real meal at a restaurant, maybe have a few drinks. Others would explore the desert. There were interesting geological formations out there. Lava tubes, volcanic craters. If you were into that sort of thing, it was actually pretty cool. Me? I read. I brought boxes of books with me. Science fiction, mostly. Which was funny because here I was, working on something that would have been pure science fiction just a decade earlier. The isolation got to some people. We had guys who couldn't handle it. They'd sign on, last maybe 6 months, and then request a transfer. No shame in that. It took a certain kind of person to live in the middle of nowhere, working rotating shifts at a potentially dangerous facility. But for those of us who stayed, there was a real sense of camaraderie. We were in this together. We relied on each other, not just at work, but in daily life. I remember one winter when we got hit with a massive snowstorm, 3 feet of snow in 24 hours. The roads were completely impassable. We were stuck at the facility, but we made it work. We had supplies, we had each other. Someone broke out a deck of cards and we had the longest poker game I've ever played. Lasted almost 12 hours across multiple shifts. And you know what? It was fun. Despite the isolation, despite the potential danger of our work, despite the harsh environment, there were moments of genuine joy and friendship. I made friends at EBR-I that I kept for decades. Guys I'd trust with my life because, in some ways, I'd trusted them with my life. When you're operating a nuclear reactor together, you're depending on your colleagues to be competent, alert, and reliable. That kind of trust creates bonds that don't break easily. By 1953, things were changing fast in the nuclear world. We weren't the only ones working on nuclear power anymore. The Soviets were developing their own reactors, the British too. And in the US, there were multiple programs running, trying different approaches. Some were using pressurized water reactors. Some were exploring boiling water reactors. There were designs using graphite moderators, heavy water moderators, and liquid metal coolants like ours. It was like the early days of aviation. Everyone had different ideas about what would work best, and the only way to find out was to build them and test them. At EBR-I, we were still pushing boundaries. In 1953, we demonstrated breeding. That means we showed that the reactor could actually produce more fissile material than it consumed. It was creating plutonium-239 from uranium-238, while simultaneously fissioning uranium-235 for power. This was huge. It meant that nuclear power wasn't limited by the availability of uranium-235, which is rare. You could potentially use the much more common uranium-238 by converting it to plutonium in a breeder reactor. The implications were staggering. Essentially unlimited power for centuries. Of course, breeding also meant producing weapons-grade plutonium, which made everyone nervous for different reasons. But scientifically, it was a triumph. We'd proven another crucial concept. There was definitely a competitive spirit developing. Not cutthroat competition, but we all wanted our reactor designs to be the ones that succeeded. There was pride involved, prestige, and frankly, funding depended on results. I remember reading reports about what other facilities were doing and thinking, we did that first, or our approach is better. But there was also collaboration. Scientists would visit from other programs. We'd share data, discuss problems, learn from each other's mistakes. It was competitive cooperation, if that makes sense. And through all of this, EBR-I kept running. We were the proof that it could work. The first. And there's something special about being first that can never be taken away. January 1954. I'm coming up on 3 years at EBR-I. I'm experienced now. I know this reactor inside and out. I've seen it in every condition, every mood. And that's dangerous. Because experience can breed complacency. It's a day shift. We're running a test. Nothing unusual. We're measuring some reactivity coefficients, which means we're making small, controlled changes to the reactor and measuring how it responds. Standard stuff. We've done it dozens of times. I'm making an adjustment to the control rods. Just a small withdrawal, maybe 2%. I'm watching the instruments as I do it, but I'm also talking to another operator about something completely unrelated. A basketball game or something. I'm not giving the control adjustment my full attention. The neutron flux jumps. Not a lot, but more than it should have for the adjustment I made. I notice it. I'm about to correct it. But then the supervisor, who's been watching, slams his hand on the table. "Thomas, eyes on the instruments. Now!" I snap to full attention. I look at the readings. Really look at them. The flux is higher than it should be, and it's still climbing slowly. I'd missed the initial trend because I was distracted. I immediately start inserting the control rods. The flux levels off and starts to decrease. Crisis averted. But it was my fault. After we stabilize everything, the supervisor pulls me aside. "What just happened?" he asks. Not angry. Just stern. I got distracted. I wasn't monitoring the response properly. And if I hadn't caught it when I did, if you hadn't been watching, that flux excursion could have gotten worse. He nods. You're experienced. You're good at this. But that's when accidents happen. When you think you've got it all figured out and you stop paying attention. Yes, sir. This reactor doesn't care how experienced you are. It doesn't care how many times you've done this before. Every single time you need to be fully present and fully focused. Understand? Yes, sir. He claps me on the shoulder. Good. Learn from it. Don't let it happen again. I didn't. That moment stuck with me for the rest of my career. Complacency kills. In nuclear work, in aviation, in medicine, in anything where lives are at stake. You can never afford to go through the motions. Every time has to be treated as if it's the first time. Full attention, full focus. That's the lesson that near miss taught me. And I'm grateful we learned it without anyone getting hurt. By late 1954, the writing was on the wall for EBR-I. Don't get me wrong. The reactor was still operating, still generating power, still contributing to research, but the focus of the national nuclear program was shifting. Bigger reactors were being designed, more powerful, more efficient. EBR-I had proven the concepts, and now it was time to move on to the next generation. There was talk of building EBR-II, a bigger, better breeder reactor that would take everything we'd learned and apply it on a larger scale. For those of us who'd been there from the beginning, it was bittersweet. We were proud of what we'd accomplished. But we also knew that our time at this particular facility was coming to an end. Some of the team started transferring to other projects, new reactor designs at other sites on the testing station. Some went to Idaho National Laboratory, which was growing rapidly. Others left for private industry as nuclear power companies started forming. I stayed through early 1955. I wanted to see it through as long as I could. There was one more major milestone we achieved. In May of 1953, we'd actually powered the entire facility with electricity from the reactor. Not just 4 light bulbs. The whole building. Lights, heating, equipment, everything. It was a symbolic moment. The reactor powering itself and its operators. A closed loop. Self-sufficient energy production from nuclear fission. We took a photo that day. The whole team outside the facility. Everyone smiling. We knew we'd done something historic. That photo sits on my desk to this day. So what did I learn from 3 years at the world's first nuclear power plant? First, that the impossible becomes possible when smart, dedicated people refuse to give up. We didn't know if this was going to work. We had theories and calculations, but reality has a way of throwing curveballs. And we figured it out. Through trial and error, through careful observation, through collaboration and persistence, we made it work. Second, that safety has to be baked into the culture. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be something you only think about when something goes wrong. It has to be present in every decision, every action, every moment. The times we got lucky, when our cowboy attitudes didn't result in injury, shouldn't be celebrated. They should be learning opportunities, because luck runs out. Third, that innovation requires both boldness and humility. Bold enough to try things that have never been done. Humble enough to admit when you don't know something, to ask for help, to learn from mistakes. The best scientists and engineers I worked with had that balance. They'd propose ambitious experiments, but they'd also be the first to say, "I don't know. Let's find out." Fourth, that small teams can do big things. We weren't a massive operation. We were a couple dozen people in the middle of nowhere. But we changed the world. That lesson has stuck with me in everything I've done since. You don't need huge resources or massive organizations to make a difference. You need the right people, a clear goal, and the determination to see it through. And fifth, that history is made by regular people. I wasn't a genius. I wasn't special. I was just a guy who was in the right place at the right time, willing to work hard and learn. Every major achievement in human history was accomplished by people who were, in most ways, ordinary. They just showed up, did the work, and didn't quit when things got hard. That's the real secret. There is no secret, just dedication, competence, and persistence. EBR-I was shut down in 1964. By then, there were multiple generations of reactors operating. Larger power reactors were coming online to feed electricity to the grid. The experimental phase was over. The commercial phase had begun. The facility was turned into a museum. If you ever find yourself in Idaho, you can visit it. It's a national historic landmark now. You can walk through the control room where we worked. You can see the reactor. You can stand in the room where electricity was first generated from nuclear power. I went back once. In the 1990s. It was strange. The equipment was still there, but it felt frozen in time, like walking into my own past. A tour guide was explaining to a group of visitors what we'd done, getting some details right, some wrong. I almost corrected her a few times, but I held back. Let them have their version of history. I know what really happened. What happened to the people? We scattered to the winds, like pioneers always do. Some went on to design commercial nuclear reactors. Some continued research at national laboratories. Some left the nuclear field entirely. Walter Zinn continued his work in nuclear energy for decades. He became a giant in the field, always credited EBR-I as one of his proudest achievements. I stayed in nuclear power for another 15 years. Worked at several commercial plants as they came online in the 1960s. Trained operators, helped refine procedures and safety protocols. Retired in 1970 and never looked back. But EBR-I stayed with me. Those 3 years shaped everything that came after. They gave me a front row seat to history. They taught me lessons that I carried for the rest of my life, and they gave me a story to tell. Today, nuclear power generates about 10% of the world's electricity. Hundreds of reactors operating in dozens of countries, providing clean, carbon-free baseload power. Every single one of them traces its lineage back to that small building in the Idaho desert. When France generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, that's EBR-I's legacy. When a submarine stays submerged for months, powered by a nuclear reactor, that's our legacy. When scientists talk about next-generation reactors that could solve our energy problems, they're building on the foundation we laid. But the legacy isn't just technological. It's also about how we approached the unknown. We proved that humanity could harness the power of the atom for peaceful purposes, not just for destruction, but for creation, for lighting homes, for powering hospitals, for enabling modern life. That was important in 1951. The atomic bomb was only 6 years old. The world was terrified of nuclear energy. We were still processing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What we did at EBR-I showed a different path. We showed that this incredible power could be controlled, could be useful, could be safe when handled responsibly. Did we get everything right? No. We made mistakes. We took risks we shouldn't have. We learned lessons the hard way. But we also demonstrated what's possible when smart people work together toward a common goal. And in a world that often feels dark and divided, that's a legacy worth remembering. You might be wondering why you should care about a small reactor in Idaho from 70 years ago. Fair question. Here's why it matters. We're facing an energy crisis. Climate change is real, and it's driven by burning fossil fuels. We need clean energy sources, and we need them now. Nuclear power is part of that solution, not the only part, but an important part. And every time someone proposes building a new nuclear plant, people get scared. They think of Chernobyl. They think of Fukushima. They think of radioactive waste and mushroom clouds. But they should also think of EBR-I. They should think of the thousands of reactor years of safe operation across the world. They should think of the millions of lives saved by replacing coal plants with nuclear plants. Because here's what most people don't realize. Coal power kills thousands of people every year through air pollution. Nuclear power, even including every accident, has killed far fewer. The statistics are clear. Nuclear is one of the safest forms of energy production we have, but fear is powerful, and misinformation spreads faster than facts. That's why stories like mine matter. Real experiences from real people who worked in the nuclear industry, who saw it from the inside, who understand both the risks and the benefits. I'm not saying nuclear power is perfect. It's not. We still haven't solved the waste problem satisfactorily. There are concerns about proliferation. Accidents, while rare, can be catastrophic when they happen. But we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. We need clean baseload power. Wind and solar are great, but they're intermittent. Nuclear provides steady, reliable power without carbon emissions. The technology we pioneered at EBR-I could help save the planet. That's not hyperbole. That's fact. So when you hear someone say nuclear power is too dangerous, remember that a small group of people in Idaho made it work 70 years ago with technology that seems primitive by today's standards. Imagine what we could do now with modern technology, modern safety systems, and lessons learned from decades of operation. That's the promise. That's the potential. And it all started with 4 light bulbs in the desert. I'm in my 90s now. Most of my colleagues from EBR-I are gone. The world has changed in ways we couldn't have imagined back in 1951. But some things remain constant. The need for energy, the human drive to innovate, the willingness of certain people to take on difficult, potentially dangerous work because it's important. When I think back to those years in Idaho, I feel pride, not just in what we accomplished technically, but in how we did it, with professionalism, with dedication, with an understanding that we were part of something bigger than ourselves. We were writing the first chapter of the nuclear age. And despite the mistakes, despite the challenges, despite the fear and uncertainty, we wrote a good chapter. The story continues. 4th-generation reactors are being designed. Small modular reactors are becoming reality. Fusion power is getting closer. The future of energy is being written right now, just like we wrote it 70 years ago. And I hope the people writing that future carry forward some of what we learned. The importance of safety, the value of thorough training, the need for constant vigilance, the power of teamwork, but also the courage to try something new, the willingness to venture into the unknown, the understanding that great achievements require risk, but that risk can be managed with care and intelligence. That's what we did at EBR-I. We took a massive risk. We ventured into completely uncharted territory. But we did it carefully, thoughtfully, and successfully. And on December 20th, 1951, when those 4 light bulbs lit up, we proved that humanity had taken one more step forward. A small step, perhaps. 4 light bulbs isn't much, but it was a step that would echo through history. Before I wrap this up, let me tell you one more story. It's 1953. We've been operating for over a year. The reactor is running smoothly. We're in a good rhythm. Everything's routine. It's late afternoon on a Friday, end of the work week. I'm finishing up my shift, ready to head back to the barracks. A kid shows up at the facility, can't be more than 16 or 17. He's with his father, who's one of the engineers from another program on the testing station. The engineer asks if his son can take a quick tour of EBR-I. The kid is interested in science, wants to be a physicist someday. The supervisor agrees. I'm assigned to give the tour since I'm about to clock out anyway. So I walk this kid through the facility, show him the control room, explain what we're doing, take him to the reactor room where he can see the core through the viewing window. His eyes are wide the whole time. He's asking questions, good questions, smart kid. At the end of the tour, he looks at me and says, "This is the coolest thing I've ever seen. You guys are making electricity from atoms. That's like science fiction." I smile. It was science fiction, 10 years ago, but we made it real. How? He asks. Hard work, good people, and a willingness to try something that might not work. He thinks about that for a moment. "I want to do something like this," he says. "I want to be part of making the impossible possible." "Then study hard," I tell him. "Learn everything you can, and when the opportunity comes, be brave enough to take it." I never saw that kid again. Never learned his name. Don't know if he ended up in the nuclear field or not, but I like to think he's out there somewhere. Maybe he became a scientist. Maybe he worked on fusion reactors or next-generation fission designs. Maybe he's doing something completely different but equally important. Or maybe he's just a guy who remembers the day he visited a nuclear reactor and decided that the impossible is worth pursuing. Either way, that's another part of our legacy. Inspiring the next generation. Showing young people that big challenges can be overcome, that the future is theirs to create. That's what we did in the Idaho desert. We didn't just light 4 bulbs. We lit imaginations. We lit possibilities. And that light is still burning. So that's my story. 3 years at EBR-I. 3 years at the beginning of the nuclear age. 3 years that shaped the rest of my life. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Would I do it again? In a heartbeat. The work was hard. The conditions were harsh. The risks were real. But we were doing something that mattered. Something that would last long after we were gone. How many people can say that about their work? We were explorers, pioneers. Not in space or across oceans, but in the realm of physics and engineering. We were mapping uncharted territory, proving what was possible. And now, 70 years later, nuclear power is an established part of our energy infrastructure. Not as big a part as it could be, perhaps. Not as widely accepted as it should be, but it's there, humming along, providing clean power to millions. Every kilowatt hour generated by a nuclear plant is a validation of what we did. Every time someone's lights stay on because a nuclear plant is providing baseload power, that's us. Every time humanity takes another step toward sustainable energy, we're part of that journey. That small building in the Idaho desert was where it all began, and I was lucky enough to be there. So if you ever find yourself in eastern Idaho, make the trip out to EBR-I. Walk through the control room, look at the reactor, read the plaques, and remember that regular people working hard at something difficult can change the world. Because we did, one atom at a time. Thanks for sticking with me through this whole story. If you found it interesting, hit that like button, share it with someone who might appreciate a bit of nuclear history, and subscribe to the channel because I've got more stories from the early days of the atomic age. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Would you have been brave enough to work at the first nuclear reactor? What other aspects of nuclear history would you like to hear about? Until next time, remember that the future is built by people willing to try the impossible, and sometimes the impossible works. See you in the next video.